All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Bears Guide 205. Now, it's a little different this time because before we get started, I want to make sure for all my students that are in my class that you are watching this for the first time on Edpuzzle and not on YouTube. If you're watching this on YouTube, it's because you're watching it a second or third, fourth, fifth time because you love these videos and you just want to study. But if it's the first time you're watching this video, you got to be on Edpuzzle. All right, so today we're talking about population statistics, our first thing in Unit 2, and by the end, we need to be able to analyze population statistics. So what are population statistics? Well, look, population statistics are the foundation to how we analyze data in countries, especially, when it comes to population. Now, what we do is that we break it down into 5 categories. You have your crude birth rate, your crude death rate, your natural increase rate, your total fertility rate, and your infant mortality rate. Now, each one of these, as an AP Human, we're not simply looking at the numbers. We're seeing how we can use this data and describe countries or areas or regions, whatever you want. So crude birth rate is real simple. How many people are born for 1,000 people? Crude death rate is simple. How many people are dying for every 1,000 people? Your natural increase rate is that growth from your CBR and CDR. So is your country increasing? Is it decreasing in population based off of birth and death? And what is that percentage? Total fertility rate is the average number of kids a woman will have in her life. Now, the biggest indicator for predicting population growth, and we are going to talk about population growth because when we talk about countries' development, we want to be able to include as many factors as possible to understand or to have a good answer on how we will predict how that country will grow. So total fertility rate, really super important factor to understand. Now, that 2.1 that you see, that total fertility rate, we're going to talk more about that in the future, but what that number is, and probably the most important number for total fertility rate, is the replacement rate. As people are dying and people are being born, we want to replace those who are leaving the game, right? And then replace them with new people who are entering the game. And that magical number of replacement is 2.1. Now, it doesn't mean like families are having 0.1 of a kid. Like that's not how this is averages. You know what I mean? So keep that in mind. Really, the two kid rule. Finally, infant mortality rate is the number of babies who die before their first birthday. Now, we can use this. Actually, I don't want to get too into detail about how we're going to use these, but we're going to use these later. So, demographic accounting, real simple. Look, when we are talking about development of a nation and we want to analyze this stuff and see how much growth there is in a country, we can't simply look at births and deaths because we also have to look at immigration, that migration into a country, and emigration, people leaving. Now, we are going to address the second half of this equation in chapter 3 when we talk about migration. But these two work together because both of these, both how many people are born and die, both how many people enter and leave the country, will create a sense of how many people are here. Now, what you see here is the difference in NIR and TFR. Now, in some places you see, like if you look at NIR, we can see the general trend once again between MDCs and LDCs, that the LDCs, the high developing nations, have higher rates of natural increase. That means they have growing populations, whereas the developed world has lower rates of NIR. And now if you look at the total fertility rate, now this is simply births inside of a country. We're not counting immigration here because that's what NIR does. Notice similar trend. The developing world is where we have people having so many kids, whereas the developed world is where we are seeing a drop in kids, with both being a problem. That huge increase in the amount of kids that people are having, or that high number amount of kids that people are having, is an issue for their country, while low amounts of kids being born is a problem for the developed world that we will explore later in this chapter. So what you really want to understand, and what I mentioned earlier, is how to use these population statistics to identify countries as MDCs, LDCs, or where they fall in between, right? So if you have a country that has lower rates of NIR, lower rates of total fertility rate, we're talking closer to that 2.1 number, that replacement rate. Generally, we can say those are more developed countries or high developing countries. They have a stronger economy. There's more opportunities for females because they're not going out, or they're not staying at home and just having kids. They're going out and they're part of the workforce. They're educated, and they're in later stages of the demographic transition model, which we haven't talked about the demographic transition model yet. It's something else we will address in chapter 2, but critical for you to understand how it's tied back to these population statistics. So if we flip it and we have higher natural increase rates, we have high total fertility rates, we're talking 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 kids per family. These are generally poorer nations. There's generally less opportunities for females. They're earlier stages of the demographic transition model. Now, like I said, we're going to explore all of these things in depth multiple times, but it's important to start understanding how we can use this data. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the infant mortality rate, we can use this to show healthcare. Now, it's really tough because I don't want to say simply good healthcare or bad healthcare. Healthcare is all around the world. Everybody has hospitals. Everybody has medicine. We have these things all throughout the world. What we have to understand is that access to healthcare. So generally, MDCs have a lower infant mortality rate because people have access to healthcare in the developed world. They can get to a hospital, they can get to the vaccines, and they can get to medicine to make sure that these kids don't die. Whereas in LDCs, we still have trouble with people getting access to that healthcare. Maybe they're in rural regions of these countries, maybe there isn't infrastructure to get them to the hospitals, or maybe they don't have the money to travel, right? The medicine exists in the developing world. What we have to break is the stigma or this idea or this assumption that people in the developing world just don't, like, they have bad healthcare. No, it's access to healthcare is what we're missing. Now, female literacy, the reason why we add this in is because when we talk about population statistics and we talk about development, these population statistics are very affected by the roles that women have in those countries. Like, what are the gender roles of women, right? And in the developing world, the role of women is typically seen as traditional: to stay at home, to work on a farm without being paid, and to raise kids, right? It's a very difficult job and requires a lot of time. Now, in the developing world, where they place education is if there is education happening, because it costs money in the developing world, it costs resources which are lacking. Generally, it's not the girls who are going to be educated, but this is the most important factor for indicating a country's natural increase rate, because if you educate women, you empower women, and they get opportunities outside the traditional home, they're going to be so busy making more money, improving that country, that they're not going to have as many kids, because the reason why you have the kids is so they can take care of you, so they can help out on the farm. But if those things are eliminated, those reasons to have kids, then you drop your country's natural increase rate. Now, female literacy is also important because it'll have an impact on the country's GDP. Obviously, if there's more women in the workforce, that means your workforce is more productive, and they're not spending money and time on kids. That means more money for the economy. And finally, education about contraception is also important for lowering birth rates in the developing world, because obviously having a kid takes away from your opportunities to go get educated, to go be empowered, to go have opportunities outside the traditional home. Finally, culture is a huge impact on population growth when we're analyzing these population statistics, because in certain countries, it's the idea that you do want to have lots of kids, that it is important to have a big family. The world can educate and provide contraceptives and provide opportunities and provide education. But at the end of the day, if culture is culture, and changing culture is really, really tough. So in these areas that are traditional, that are primarily agricultural, breaking these ideas of having to have multiple kids or to have sons is really, really difficult. And now what we're just seeing are some general maps of crude birth rates throughout the world, noticing trends. Where do we have the highest birth rates? Where do we have the lower birth rate? Same thing with death rates. We're noticing these trends over and over again, these similar ones where in developed nations you have lower instances of it, in the developing world you have higher instances. And then we see natural increase, once again looking at this map, but now we are talking about doubling time. Now, doubling time is something geographers or population or demographic analysts use to predict when a population will double. And the reason why we calculate the doubling time of a country is because we want to make sure that we can prepare for those resources for that country, right? To make sure that they will be okay. All right, so what you need to know today. You have to understand why it's important to be able to analyze population data. It's a tool for analyzing development, right? Like, we have to know that not only you have to understand what are your 5 indicators of population statistics, but how to manipulate those 5 indicators to understand what a country is going through. Yeah, I brought them up here. So know your CBR, know your CDR, NIR, IMR, and TFR. Understand what each one of these will help predict, and have an understanding of where we see these trends in the world, that the lower instances of these things are in the developed world and the higher instances of these indicators are in the developing world. Okay, so that is another episode to Bear's Guide to a 5. As always, make sure to smash that like button, leave a comment if you want, and subscribe so you know when new videos come out. We'll see you next time.